Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this third episode of the JLU Knowledge Series webinars that we have been, doing. We did the first one on hospitality. That was about 3 days back. Today, the entire day was devoted to journalism and mass communication. We had a first one, which was a brilliant one around advertising with Kunal Sinha. Second was around public relations and social distancing with Hal Sarudin, who's a corporate communications head for Rolls-Royce Motor Cars. And now we have come to the third session, which I feel is going to be most remarkable because it's around journalism. It's with an expert and a professor who leads programs at London College of Communication, University of Arts London. He's Mr. Simon Hinde, who's a program director for journalism and publishing. But before I come to introducing Simon to every one of you, I just wanted to, some of you may have joined now, wanted to introduce about Jharkhand Lake City University. Jharkhand Lake City University essentially has been most awarded university in Central India. Consecutively for about 4 or 5 years, we have been rated as the best university in Central India, number one. We have around 56 degree programs around undergraduate, postgraduate, as well as doctoral levels. About 3,000 students or so. Students come from all over India, about 28 states of India. And the most interesting and most enriching part of it is that we have about 27 of global's best universities as our partners related to different disciplines. With Jharkhand School of Journalism and Communication, we have University of Arts London, who has been a long-standing partner with us. We had some summer schools and some exchange programs going, and we look forward to a lot of collaboration to bring the best value to JLU students on one side and maybe contribute to academic life at London College of Communication as well. Simon is a brilliant professor and a journalist as well as a communication thinker, and he not only leads the program at London College of Communication, but most important, he brings a lot of new thinking into the entire thing. Simon, he started his career as a researcher, writer, and editor with Bit Magazine, specializing in financial matters before joining the Sunday Times as consumer affairs correspondent. Simon moved on to Daily and Sunday Express, where he worked in a variety of senior editorial roles and as a commentator of political and economic affairs. In 2004, Simon joined Yahoo UK as an editorial director before moving on to AOL in a similar role. Then in 2007, he joined Sky, leading their online editorial efforts before becoming Director of Online Products, responsible for building websites, applications, iPads, and so many other devices. He has appeared many times on radio and television as a commentator and pundit, including the Today's program, Newsnight and Sky News, where he's a regular newspaper reviewer and has written various range of publications in UK, including Financial Times, Daily Telegraph, New Statesman, and The Spectator. Very interestingly, joining London College of Communication in 2013, he's strongly committed to a multimedia, multi-platform world, which I believe is the future. We all know that in India as well, multimedia platforms are growing phenomenally. Media houses are using it very notably, and I think to have Simon as a speaker today and share his insights with all of you is so pertinent, and especially in the times when we are facing so much of a crisis. I think journalism, so to say, has to raise its bar. One of the things which is a topic on which Simon is going to speak is the neighborhood reporting or the local reporting, so to say. And because I think that's a very, very important area to work on, both for the journalism students as well as for the professionals. So Simon, I'll hand it over to you to take the session forward, please.
Thank you, Durga. So it's a great pleasure and a great honour to be invited to speak to you today, and I thank Professor Shukla for organising this fantastic event. It represents part of the growing relationship between our two institutions, which is going to develop through, I hope, staff and student exchanges and perhaps joint projects over the years. So I'm very excited to be able to speak to you here today. London College of Communication, for those who don't know, is part of University of the Arts London, which is one of the biggest creative arts, design, media universities in the world. And as Professor Shukla said, I run the journalism and publishing program at London College of Communication. and we have a range of courses around the field of journalism and publishing, and a very active research base. I'm really pleased to be invited to speak on this topic as well, because it's fantastically sort of relevant and pertinent subject, bearing on the crisis in which we are all living at the moment. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you'll be able to see my slides, and I will start talking. So I click that, and
yes,
with you can see my slides. I'll just make it full screen.
Yeah.
Great, excellent. So local journalism in the COVID-19 era is a great topic. I'm going to talk specifically, as I guess you would expect, from a British point of view, but I think that the things I have to say will have wider resonance than that, because I think journalists all over the world are confronting very many of the same challenges. But I thought, just to start off, it's worth thinking about some of the very particular characteristics of Britain that mean that local might mean something slightly different than it means in other countries. So first of all, Britain is a small country. It's about 600 miles top to bottom. You can fly from one end to the other in 2 hours. I think the record flight time is 45 minutes. It's a day's driving, so it's a very small country. But London is a very big city. Not so much by size, it's about the 30th largest in the world, but by measures of wealth and influence. It regularly comes very high in surveys about influence and power. It's the world's second most influential city in the ATE Kearney Index. It's been top of the Global Power City Index for the last 7 years. So London is a big, big city in a small, small country. And let's see what that looks like. So just in terms of population, you can see London is far, far bigger than any other city in the United Kingdom. And if you put that in an Indian context, I did some rough sums. In terms of population, it would be as if the population of New Delhi was 200 million. So that gives you a sense of the size of London just in terms of population relative to other cities in the UK. London dominates in a way that is almost unique. I think only Moscow in Russia is bigger relative to the country in which it sits than London is in the United Kingdom. So there's some more figures. GVA, it's a measure really of wealth and productivity, but you can see again how much bigger London is, 7 times bigger than its nearest competitor, and even more so by individual wealth and productivity. And that the consequences of that, or perhaps the causes of that, are that in Britain, power, politics, finance, industry, culture, and the media are enormously centred in London. London casts an enormous shadow, really, in a way, over the rest of the country. I think that's different from many other countries, and it does have an effect on the media. You hear people in Britain often talking about the London media, meaning the mass media, and the local media is seen as a much smaller, less significant thing. Wrongly, in my view, but that is how it's seen. So I want to introduce you to our current national hero, who is a man called Captain Thomas Moore. Some of you might have heard of him because he's had a certain amount of international coverage. He's a 99-year-old ex-military gentleman who decided about 3 weeks ago that he was going to raise some money for charity by walking around his garden at home. His garden, I think, is about 50 meters in total, and he was going to do 100 circuits of his garden before he reached his 100th birthday, which is actually next week, I believe, on Thursday. And he thought he'd raise some money from his friends and family. He thought he might raise about £1,000 for the National Health Service, because he's had treatment in hospitals, and he wanted to celebrate that by raising some money for the nurses and doctors who had treated him. So he set off on this endeavour. And within a couple of weeks, he was on the BBC, he was on ITV, which is another of our national broadcasters. They're making a documentary about him. He was in the Daily Mail. He was in American newspapers and also Times of India. And he's raised, I think last night I heard he's raised £30 million. So starting from a target of £1,000, he's raised £30 million, and he's been everywhere in the national media. He's leading our television news many nights. He's on the front pages of our newspapers. He's an immense national and now international figure. And a lot of his success, everybody thinks it's magnificent. You know, it's a good news story at a very difficult time. And his success, his fundraising success, has been very much driven by the media. And that's all great. But it's worth thinking about where this started. So 7th of April, it started with this story in the local newspaper, the Bedford newspaper. Now, Bedford is a small town somewhere to the north of London, and it's got its own small newspaper. And the local reporter, Claire Turner, found out that this man, he wasn't even called Captain Tom, he was just Bedford man, was going to embark on this project to raise £1,000 or so. And she wrote a little piece about it for the local newspaper. And that was where the story started. Because Claire Turner wrote about Captain Tom in her local newspaper, then it was seen by other outlets. It then got onto the BBC, it got onto ITV, got onto the Daily Mail, and his success came from that. But without the local news story, none of this would have happened, I think. He would not have, the BBC would never have heard of him, ITV would never have heard of him, the New York Times would never have heard of him. He would never have raised this money. So that one little story in the local Bedford newspaper has had these enormous national and now international ramifications and have raised £30 million for our health service. And that's one piece of local journalism. And I think that shows the power of local journalism. The London-based media, the national media, would never have found Captain Tom, I think, had it not been for that local story. Because local journalism, at its best, it knows its community, it tells stories about the people in that community, human stories, it celebrates their achievements, and it feeds the ecology of news. If you think of news and journalism as a kind of interconnected set of entities, an ecology, an infrastructure, then local journalism is a really important part of that. And I sometimes think of local journalists as being like bees. Bees fly from plant to plant, pollinating, taking their pollen from one plant to another. Local journalists do the same thing. They find these stories that seem interesting in a local context, and those stories spread. And the whole of the infrastructure, the environment, the ecology of news and journalism is enriched by their activity. So local journalists, in this sense, are like bees. And like bees, they should be looked after and preserved and helped to thrive. So local news in the time of COVID-19. It's a very interesting moment for us to reflect on local news, local journalism. And I think what we learn about local news and local journalism in this moment is, in a sense, nothing new. It's nothing that we didn't know already. But what this crisis has done is to focus our attention on the things that are going well for local news and local journalism, the things that are going less well. And perhaps it helps us to think of a future, a successful future for the local journalism industry. So at this moment, more than any other, I think the public want to know what's going on. They want facts, information, advice. They want up-to-date, reliable facts, information, advice, and they want to know what's happening in their area. And the national media is not terribly good at doing that. That's not necessarily a criticism of the national media, because the national media has a different job to do. It tells us the big national picture, the big policy and political debates. It doesn't necessarily tell us what's happening on the ground in your local hospital, in your local area. Local news can do all of that, and right now, that is what we want. We want to know what's happening in our local hospital, what shops are open, what restaurants are delivering food, is the local railway station open. We want that kind of very granular local information. Local newspapers, local publications can provide that. And what we are seeing is we're seeing the proof of that. In Britain, at least, audiences for local news are soaring. Local news websites are reporting increases of between 200 to 500% in traffic. So that's real evidence that people are flocking to local news outlets in order to find out what's going on at this moment. And in a very general sense, this is the most recent figure I can find. It's from the Reuters Institute Digital News Report from last year. It's an annual survey that they do. We can see that people trust local newspapers. So you can see on that slide, the 5th item down, regional local newspaper has a trust score of 6.4. Those figures are out of 10. So that's a good, healthy figure. Only one national newspaper, the Financial Times, does better than regional or local newspapers. All the other national newspapers, the Times, the Guardian, the Independent, Telegraph, the Mirror, the Mail, and the Sun are well below local news. So there is a strong trust in local news. People believe what they read in their local newspaper. Now, I want to talk to you about a place called Scarborough, which some of you may have heard of, many of you probably have not. It's a small, in British terms, it's a medium-sized city, a medium-sized town, not big enough to be called a city. It's got a population of about 60,000, I think. Its districts, its wider areas, about 120,000. It's in the northeast of England. It's a seaside town. You can see some pictures on that postcard. The reason I want to focus on Scarborough is because one of my former students, Corinne MacDonald, is now a reporter on the local newspaper in Scarborough. And I thought I'd ask her what her experiences have been of reporting on COVID-19 in her area. And this is what she told me. So she said, first of all, what COVID-19 has done for local news, it's made news brands, whether that's newspapers or websites, think about how they engage with their readers, really give it some consideration. And perhaps, think about the real virtues and values of local journalism. And what that has meant, it's reignited the community element of local news. Really trying to make a connection with local people, which I think many local journalists would say that perhaps that had got lost for a variety of reasons I'll talk about later. And the other thing Corinne said was very important is the tone of their reporting. That there has been a tendency, I think, across the media, certainly in Britain, for journalists on the web to compete for clicks and traffic by being rather sensationalist and excitable. And Corinne says that at this moment, what people want is a sense of proportion. They want accuracy and reliability. They don't want unnecessary drama. So they've had to think quite hard about that. So this has helped them to reconsider themselves and perhaps go back to some of the kind of essential values of local journalism, the sense of a connection with local people, that they're not just a rather kind of faceless media organisation which sits in an office and has very little to do with the community. They want to be out in the community. They want to present reliable and trustworthy voices. They want to find local people who have something to say about the current situation that local people can trust. So whether that's figures from the health service or local politicians or whoever it may be, it's finding those people who are reliable and trustworthy. And it's telling local stories, because certainly in the national media, in the London-based media, COVID is presented very much as a political policy story with a lot of numbers, the numbers of deaths, the numbers of cases, the numbers of people taken into hospital. And that can be rather overwhelming, I think, for any of us. It's very hard for us to understand what that means at a human scale. So telling local stories is a way of doing that. So COVID, the current crisis, has helped local newspapers think about some of those issues. And I think they would see that probably as a kind of reversion to the best qualities of local journalism, which may have got lost somewhat in recent times. Putting the local back in local news, what's going on in your area, what's happening, as I said, to your local hospital, on your local high street, which shops are open, which are not. The names behind the statistics. People want to know about who has perhaps been ill but survived it, who sadly perhaps has died as a result of COVID in their area. They want to be able to put names to faces, and that kind of human connection, telling stories through people, creates a kind of reality to the story, which is lost when it's presented, as it is in the national media very often, as simply a set of statistics. Also very important for local journalism is local scrutiny. And this is going to become more important, I think, as the crisis goes on, because in Britain, at least, we've gone through a sort of phase of we all have to pull together and we're all in this together. And we're now starting to look at the way politicians, the health service are doing their job. Are they doing a good job? Could things be improved? This is happening at the national level, and that's a healthy thing. It needs to happen at a local level as well. How well is your local hospital performing? How well is local government managing the situation? Local newspapers, local journalists need to provide that kind of scrutiny. That's a really key role of local journalism. The other thing that's important is, and again, this is something that national news tends not to do very well. National news focuses often on bad news, on crises, on things that are going wrong, on rows and arguments. Good news is important too. We saw the story of Captain Tom I started this presentation with, raising all that money for the National Health Service, a good news story. Perhaps a doctor that saved a life, an elderly person who caught COVID and has survived. People want good news as well as bad. Local news can do that very well. So here's an example of, this is from the newspaper group that Corin's Scarborough newspaper belongs to. They have papers all over the country, so Hartlepool, Derbyshire, Falkirk, Chad, Fife. These are all towns and cities in England and Scotland. And they've run this campaign called You Are All Heroes, Health Heroes it's called. And the point of this campaign is to celebrate local people who have done good things at this moment of crisis. I'll show you the web page from Scarborough, from Corin's paper. Well, you can see that, but they've invited the general public to send in photos of friends and family on the front line. In other words, nurses and doctors who are working in this crisis to keep people healthy and alive. And I think this is a really powerful thing that local papers can do. And I think about, when I grew up in a place called Chester, which is a small city, about 100,000 people in the northwest of England. In the 1970s, when I was young, there were two quite substantial newspapers in Chester, the Chester Chronicle and the Chester Observer. And you were either, in Chester at that time, your household was either an Observer household or a Chronicle household. They were weekly papers, big, fat, broadsheet papers full of local news. And if you got your picture in the paper, Perhaps the photographer came to your local school to photograph something that was going on, or maybe the local women's institute or a local business that had done something. It was a big moment to appear in the local paper. Everybody read it, everybody would see it, everybody would know the thing that you'd done, the great thing you'd done to help the local community, whatever your success was. And, you know, these are in towns and cities of this sort of size, 60, 70,000 people, everybody knows each other. So if someone's in the paper, lots of people will know that person. They will talk about it. They will share the story. This is a really powerful thing that local news can do. And I think local journalists would say perhaps has been rather lost in recent years. So this Health Heroes campaign is a way of getting back to that. I think it's important and interesting from that point of view. But as I was going through Corin's newspaper's website, I came across a letter from the editor, quite a long letter, and these are a couple of paragraphs which I've picked out of it. And he says, almost certainly you, the readers, are here because you value the quality and integrity of the journalism produced by the Yorkshire Post's journalists. The Yorkshire Post is the parent newspaper. Almost all of which live alongside you in Yorkshire, spending the wages they earn with Yorkshire businesses who last year took this title to the industry watchdog's most trusted newspaper in Britain accolade. And that is why, he says, I must make an urgent request of you. As advertising revenue declines, your support becomes ever more crucial to the maintenance of the journalistic standards expected of the Yorkshire Post. If you can safely, please buy a paper or take up a subscription. We want to continue to make you proud of Yorkshire's national newspaper. We are going to need your help, he says. So you can see in that message a clear note of worry and concern about the financial situation of newspapers. That there he is, the editor, saying we're doing this fantastic job, our circulation is rising, everybody's coming to our website, you trust us, but the money's not there. So please buy the paper, please take up a subscription. So this is the other side of the situation for local journalism at the moment. So news is a public good, what economists call the public good. And we see that very strongly in at the moment, because local news can emphasize positive behavior. It encourages people to maintain social distancing, to observe the lockdown that we're in, not to do things that might put other people at risk, not to waste the time of doctors. It combats rumor and fake news. And in doing this, it reduces the spread of disease. It reduces the pressure on the health service. That's a huge benefit to society. And you can measure that in more than just money, but you can measure it in money. You know, it's saving resources for the health service. It's stopping people getting ill. So there's a huge, huge benefit. But who is paying for this benefit is the question. At the moment, the value that local news provides for society is not being paid for effectively. And that's why editors, like the editor of the Yorkshire Post, are putting notes in their newspaper saying, begging people to buy the newspaper and take up subscriptions. And this, by the way, is a long-term trend. This is not something new. And it's not even just a local trend. National news as well is struggling with revenue difficulties, but local news has struggled particularly for probably about 20 years. But the COVID crisis is throwing this into very, very sharp relief. So people value local news. This is from the Ofcom News Consumption Survey, which again is an annual survey done by the Office for Communications, which is the British government regulator of journalism. And you can see reasons why people follow news. Number 3, to know what's going on in my local area. So people value local news. The question is, will they pay for it? So some long-term trends that have affected, sort of negatively affected the financial viability of local news. First of these is the switch over time from print to digital. So going back to my my childhood years in Chester in the 1970s, where pretty much every household would buy the physical newspaper every week, and each of those newspapers had big offices with many journalists, and that was a good solid income stream. Alongside that, there were good solid advertising markets. Estate agents advertised properties there. Anybody wanted to sell a car would sell a car in the local newspaper. Jobs were advertised in the local newspaper. There were personal ads, so if an individual wanted to sell their car or a piece of furniture or anything else, they would take out an advert in the local newspaper, and so on. Now, of course, as we all know, in the digital era, along came Craigslist, along came Google, along came all sorts of big advertising monoliths, and they took away those markets from local newspapers. So the advertising market collapsed just at the same time as the regular subscriber print model was collapsing as well. Facebook and Google grew in their importance. Local newspapers came to seem like one digital voice among many. So, you know, you will log onto your computer in the morning, and maybe you'll have a look at the Daily Mail and the Guardian and the BBC, and maybe you look at your local newspaper website as well, but it lacks perhaps some of the salience that it used to have in the days when a big fat copy of the Cheshire Observer would land on your doormat on a Friday, and you would pick it up and read it from cover to cover and see if your friends were in there. There's a lack of investment in journalism. I think the companies that own local newspapers, and there are about 6 big companies in Britain who own many local newspapers between them, have not done a terribly good job over the last 20 years of investing in journalism. They've rather had a model of cutting back, and it's been a difficult job for them because, as I've noted, revenue models are declining, and they've tended to sort of retrench rather than invest. And that's meant that journalists, I think, and I think many journalists will acknowledge this, they've gone for clickbait rather than quality. They've gone for things that will generate lots of quick clicks through a Google search or on Facebook or on social media, rather than the kind of quality engaged local journalism that used to be done. So these are all long-term trends. And then there are some particular COVID problems. So we've seen traffic growth, but as was noted, or was touched on in that the editor's letter I showed you, a collapse in advertising. There's been a collapse in advertising principally because the businesses that still advertise in local newspapers are now closed, most of them. Restaurants, car showrooms, estate agents, whatever it may be, they're closed, they're not advertising. So that money is gone for the time being. There's an extra problem with advertising blacklisting. Now, those advertisers who are still out there advertising on the media, very many of them refuse to have their adverts on pages which have stories which they consider are gloomy, depressing, or negative. So this is something that's always happened. So, for example, airlines will blacklist news stories about air crashes for obvious reasons. But what's happening in the current crisis is that many, many businesses are blacklisting stories about COVID or coronavirus. So they refuse to have their adverts on those pages. So you can see what a problem that is for journalists, local journalists. Most of their journalism currently, rightly, is about COVID, coronavirus, the crisis. Advertisers are refusing to advertise on those pages. So it's very, very difficult for that enormous advertising growth, 400% advertising growth, which is mainly driven by stories about coronavirus. You can't monetize those pages. Then you've got very practical problems of very few people are commuting now. Commuting is obviously the time when typically people will read a newspaper. So that market's gone. News agents are closed. The places where you can buy newspapers are there are fewer of them. So these are very particular issues, economic and logistical issues that are current at the moment, which are making it hard for local journalism to capitalise on the enormous reader interest that there is out there. So that's why the editor of the Yorkshire Post is putting essentially begging letters in his newspapers, encouraging people to support them at this difficult time. So what does this mean? I mean, there's a very gloomy prognosis, and then there's a happier prognosis. So the gloomy prognosis is that this is an extinction event for local media. That's a phrase used by someone at BuzzFeed, actually, in the States, but I think it potentially applies here. That what we're seeing now, on top of the difficulties and problems that local news has faced in the last couple of decades, is going to destroy the local news infrastructure, to kill all the bees, in my metaphor. So what will happen, according to this prognosis, is that when the COVID crisis is over, traffic will drop again. The 400, 500% increases we've seen will fall away back to the previous levels. And advertising will stay away. So all those advertisers who, for various reasons, have chosen not to be in local newspapers, local websites at the moment, won't come back. Perhaps just because they haven't got the revenue themselves, perhaps because they've decided they can manage without it. Readers will stay away. But those readers who perhaps were loyal purchasers of the newspaper on their daily commutes, who will have lost a habit of buying a newspaper and won't pick that habit up again. And then that will in turn mean a flight from quality, that as local media deals with fewer resources, it will do journalism that is less good, and it will pursue clickbait and trivial stories over the kind of in-depth engagement that we've talked about earlier on. And you can very readily see how that becomes a vicious circle of poor quality journalism, fewer readers, less revenue, and that will lead to closures and to the extinction event. And we've seen some signs of that perhaps in Britain. We've seen some local newspapers have closed up, at least for the time being. At the moment, their intention is to reopen, but will they be able to? We don't know. So there is a very gloomy prognosis that one can take from current events. Or there's a happy ending, which is obviously the one that I hope for, which is that the values of local journalism are reaffirmed. That, as my former student Corinne said, we've come to understand again what local journalism really means and why it matters to local people and how to do that. We'll reassert our links with communities, and through that, the audience growth will be maintained, and local journalism will once again find its place at the heart of local communities, and local communities will reward that engagement through buying the newspaper, through going to the website, and we will have what we are seeing at the moment, a successful, engaged, community-based, local journalistic project that will take us through to the next few decades. And that will mean advertisers return, subscribers return, and then the revenue is reinvested in high-quality journalism. It remains to be seen which of those two outcomes is the one that we will return to in the next few weeks and months. So thank you very much for listening. Now, Divika, I don't know if you'd like me to go through the questions that were posted earlier on, or I tried to answer some of them in the talk.
Yeah, Simon, I have some more questions which have come, because a few of the things you did cover as a part of your kind of a presentation. So I'm happy that you could kind of use some of the questions which will be sent to you from the audience and use it. One of the questions which has come from a second-year undergraduate student of journalism, Dipanshi. Her question essentially is that right now, from a local news perspective, because there's so much of a coverage in the local media about COVID-19, about various issues. Once and hopefully, once we are over this particular crisis, again, there would be a tapering off, and she's talking more from a perspective of individual publications, that there would be a tapering of, readership and less of interest of community and people in the journalism again, in the media again, because right now virus is a big news. But what happens post this? Would the interest kind of taper down post this?
That's a really interesting question. One of the things that my former student Corinne said was that they are noticing now that people are getting not exactly bored with COVID-19 stories, but they're feeling that they want to know other things as well. That the kind of single focus on COVID-19 is no longer necessarily the thing that their readers want. So they're already starting to look for other stories in their local area that are interesting and relevant and engaging to their audience. So I think just as certainly in Britain, we're anticipating that there will be a gradual return to normality, that there won't be one day when we move from lockdown to normality. It will be a process over weeks and months. I think that same process will be available for journalists, that they will be able, sensible journalists like Corinne are thinking now about what else can we tell our readers that is not just about COVID. So there is a move over time to the post-COVID world when we're no longer talking about it, but we found other things to talk about. But the key thing, I think, is that whatever those stories are, that they're informed by the very positive values that Corinne and other local journalists have identified as being at the heart of their COVID coverage. Those values that I talked about of community and accuracy and honesty and reliability and trustworthiness. If local journalists can bring those values to bear on whatever stories they do, which are not COVID stories, not post-COVID stories, then that I think is their best chance of taking their currently engaged public with them into the post-COVID world.
Excellent. Simon, in fact, one of my final year journalism students, Yamin Dhar, has asked a similar question. What he's saying is, and this is pretty true globally, but a lot is happening in India, that there have been a lot of fake news and a lot of reporting of those fake news, those events happening in the media, both television as well as print as well as digital. Now, what's happening is when these hate speeches are reported without being verified, it triggers off negative reactions across the country. So Yamin's question essentially is that as a journalist, what should be those stories or events which a journalist should avoid in these situations, apart from obviously fact checking?
Yeah, this is a very important and very difficult question. I mean, we live in a world where the President of the United States is telling people to inject bleach. So fake news is a massive, massive problem, and a very, very hard one to address. And I don't think it falls just to journalists to address it, by the way. It's a social problem that is engaged through politics and all aspects of society. I think local news has got a very particular role to play. As I noted in my talk, certainly in Britain, I suspect it's probably true in other countries as well, local news is much more trusted than national news. And that's, I guess, because of the local connections that those publications have forged over many years. So because local news has that position of trust, first of all, it has to value it and preserve it, and it needs to avoid doing some of the bad things that certainly national newspapers in my country have done, of being rather sensationalistic and putting daft stories on the front page that are only half true and not checking things, and all those things have contributed to the decline in trust in national news. Local news needs to avoid doing that, and they have not always avoided that. Sometimes they've played rather fast and loose with the truth. I think one of the things that Corinne said when I talked to again my former student was that they are now being very careful not to be sensationalists, not to put stories on the website just because they know they'll generate lots of traffic. They are taking care to be accurate and sober and reflective and thoughtful. And I think you have to see that as a long-term game, because any of us who've worked as journalists know that it's quite easy to drive large amounts of traffic online by saying something sensational which may not be completely true and accurate. But if over time you avoid doing that and you have a reputation for being accurate and trustworthy, that will repay itself over time. I mean, if the slide I showed of the most trusted parts of the British media, the most trusted newspaper is the Financial Times, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, is a very, very sober and serious newspaper. It's the opposite of sensationalist, and it has a reputation for being boring but accurate, and over time that's translated itself into a very strong financial position. Local news, I think, needs to think the same way. It needs to take the long view and avoid doing the kind of the sensationalist things that may get a big spike of traffic and lots of Facebook likes and the rest of it. We won't do that. We'll do the serious, sober, reliable, community engaging stuff, and we'll take a 5 and 10 year view, not a kind of number of clicks this day view.
That was a great insight, Simon. A couple of questions more have come, and I really request if you can answer them. One of them, one of the students actually asked, is there a way that journalists can work with communities to tell their own stories? And I believe that she's trying to allude towards citizen journalism or something related to that.
Yes, I think that's really interesting. It's a really very, very good question, and it's something I could talk about for hours. But in brief, I think that is really important. I think it's important partly because local newspapers don't necessarily have the resources to cover large communities in the way they used to. There are some very interesting examples in Britain of community newspapers which are doing this kind of thing, which are encouraging communities to tell their own stories. And I think that is something that it needs to work at an institutional level. I think a newspaper needs to do that. I think it's harder for an individual journalist to do that, but I think for media organizations to reach out to community groups and bodies and equip them with the tools and the knowledge and the skills to tell those stories, I think is going to be a very, very important thing in the future. Yes, it's a very good point.
Absolutely. And Simon, just on this point, because I recalled, I was talking to you about this Lake City Voice, which is a JLU's radio station. I think from Tuesday onwards, we're going to relay audio letters from small children in central India. What they've done is we have recorded the audio letters to the editors or to us from different children across this particular region, and they are narrating what they're doing during those stay-at-home scenario. So it's a very interesting way, like you described, to kind of coordinate with the local communities and groups and get their stories out in the way that they want to. One more question which has come up, Simon, is related to the current pandemic because it's a health crisis. So generally, the question has come up is from one of the person is that journalists should be mindful of constantly changing the research scenario right now in general, but especially during a pandemic, one has to report accurately because it's a science and health related issue, and they should not accidentally mislead people. So how important it is research, particularly from a science and health reporting perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think national publications mostly have health and science editors who are able to, have devoted their careers to understanding the issues that emerge out of things like pandemics, so are well placed to take an informed view of perhaps what we're being told by government or what doctors are saying. Local news journalists tend to be more generalist because there are fewer of them. So, if you're a local news reporter, you might be reporting on what's happening in local schools one day, local hospitals another day, local politics the next day. So very hard to have the same level of expertise. So I think it's a question of, I mentioned this in the presentation, finding the reliable local voices who you can amplify, so people that you can trust to tell a truthful story. I think this is difficult, and when I talked to Corinne, my former student, she reflected on this and said one of the difficult things at the moment is getting information that is accurate and reliable. Not necessarily because there is a great conspiracy to cover things up, but because this is a new situation, we're not very prepared for it. The people who have expertise and knowledge are probably very hard pressed, working in their hospitals, working in their local government. They haven't got a great deal of time to find information and make it available to the media. So I think it's an obligation on the media to find that information and find those people. And if they're not sure about the validity or reliability of a piece of information, be careful how they present it. You know, if the President of the United States is saying inject yourself with bleach, then don't present that as if that is an unchallenged truth. You know, put that in the appropriate context. You know, these are really important. You know, these are, in a way, they're kind of standard and basic journalistic lessons. But what we're seeing in the current crisis is that a lot of the, you know, the long-held and honoured truths of journalism become very vividly illustrated in our current situation.
Right. One of another student, she asked that while many of the communities or many of the what you call service providers are facing a high risk because they are covering the news, or they may be health workers or whatnot, and reporters, particularly from a field reporting perspective, they are at high risk because they themselves may contract this particular virus. So how much should the editors and the newspaper organizations, or for that matter, media organizations, should be taking care of their own reporters when they go out in the field?
Well, it's a really important point, and the answer is very much so. You know, when newspapers and broadcasters send journalists into war zones, they give them training, they give them the appropriate equipment, they give them advice on what to do and what not to do, and the same thing applies now. One would hope that journalists who are going into perhaps hospitals or care homes where there's a high risk of the virus are given the appropriate protective equipment, are given guidance on appropriate levels of social distancing. I suspect that this is probably happening unevenly at the moment, not necessarily because editors and newspaper owners are malicious or careless, but because there is a shortage in Britain, at least, of the protective equipment that's needed. There's perhaps an imperfect understanding of the measures that are taken. But certainly, when you talk to local journalists, I think on the whole they are behaving sensibly. When we watch in Britain televised journalism, it's very clear when interviews take place that the interviewer is standing a good distance away from the interviewee and is using a long microphone, and often they are wearing masks. There's a bit of a debate in Britain about the validity of wearing masks or not wearing masks. But I think the public health message generally in Britain has been very widely understood and received, and that includes by journalists. But I think you're absolutely right that there is a duty of care on the part of editors and proprietors to ensure that their journalists are not placed at unnecessary risk.
Sanchit, you have asked a question to Simon, which is related to, again, to advertisers coming and supporting the media organizations in terms of generating advertising revenues and all that. I think he answered this particular, or he touched upon this point in his presentation, where he talked about the challenges which the media would face, or the newspapers would face. But there's a positive side as well, he talked about, and so he has brought this point into his presentation as well. Simon, I wanted to ask you, because there are many of the audiences who are already listening to your webinar. They are either students of journalism and communication right now in the university, or they may be planning to take up journalism as a future discipline or career. What would be your advice be to them, so to say, how should they get employment ready? I mean, what are the things a budding journalist should keep in mind as he or she gets ready to take up a career, profession, full time?
Good question. Well, I think perhaps the most important thing is to be interested and aware of the news. So, to be interested and curious about what's going on in the world, and that would naturally involve reading newspapers, listening to the radio, watching television news, and so on and so forth, and to engage with those news sources in a kind of in a critical and questioning way. So think about what you're being told. Are you being told the story that you need to hear? Are you getting all sides of the story? Are there voices you're not hearing? Is there information you're not getting? So develop the habit of criticality, I think, is important. On a very practical note, I think I would always advise a young person, someone who's at school or in the early years of university, to take any opportunities or pursue opportunities really to do practical work. I don't quite know how the system works in India, but it's very common in Britain for students to go and do placements or internships at media organisations, and even if that's only for a week. At the age of 16 or 17, when you're at school, to do a week or 2 weeks in a newspaper office, maybe not doing very much practical work, but observing, helping out, doing a bit of research. I think all that stuff is really interesting because it gives you a flavour of what the work is like, and it will help you to understand whether you're well suited for it. So I think pursue those opportunities, take them up if you can, consume the news, develop the habit of criticality, think about how you would tell stories. Are the stories in your area or stories from your community or for your family and friends that you think are worth telling? And through that, you develop the habits of mind that will serve you well in the journalistic profession.
Simon, I mean, happy to note, because I know that LCC and UL is a very, very practice-based institution. You support a lot of that. Unfortunately for us at Jharkhand Lake City University, and especially at the School of Journalism and Communication, we kind of encourage our students to do a lot of internship, and while studying, post classes, they're doing a lot of work. And yeah, you are absolutely correct. I think that's the best way of testing yourself in the field. There's a point of poser which has come up from Pranav Agarwal. He's one of the audiences. He has said that, is there a difference between writing for the local publications or local news, so to say, and at the national level? Is there a difference between the writing styles?
Good question. Interesting question. I think there's a difference between publications. I don't think there's a category difference between local and national in terms of writing styles. I think every publication has its own voice and its own style. I think the difference really is much more one of, it's more at the level of the research that you do and who you speak to and how you think about your audience. I think the really key thing, the real key value at the local level is there's a much more direct and intimate relationship with your audience, who are local people who you might meet in the pub or in the shop, or might be family and friends. Whereas at a national level, it's probably a bigger audience, much more widespread audience, people who you may never actually meet and you have a different connection to. So I think that's possibly, it's a psychological difference rather than a difference that necessarily presents itself in writing style.
Okay, Simon, the last question, so to say, relates to, because there are lots of students, as I'm talking about more from a JLU perspective, lots of applications now flowing in for students who want to take admission in journalism program at the undergraduate and postgraduate level, and since these students are like waiting for the universities to reopen and the classes to start, maybe we'll start virtually earlier than that. What is your one advice to them to kind of, because this is the time when they can sharpen their tools, they can be at home and study and read. What should they be? How should they be preparing themselves to getting before they get back to the classes?
Well, I think this is a great moment for the study of journalism, actually, because I think this is a moment where journalism is immensely important, where it's central to the life of our countries. So I think simply consuming as much journalism as you can, and obviously we have the benefit of, through the internet, being able to consume journalism in many countries. So I think to consume, I mentioned criticality earlier on. I think having a critical and questioning view of the journalism you consume, looking at ways it's done differently in different countries, and thinking about, well, okay, in America they do it this way, in Britain they do it this way, in India they do it this way. What are the pros and cons of those different approaches? I think are very helpful. I would encourage I mean, anybody, not just actually a prospective journalism student, but I think anybody at the moment, to keep their own journal of what's going on, because it is such an extraordinary and unique time that future historians, apart from anything else, will value the written or audio or video recorded records of our lives at this moment. And that's a form of journalism. You know, if we observe what's going on in the world around us and write it down or film it or record it, then I think that's, you know, there's that's like the first step in journalism. I'm doing a project with a number of my students who are on lockdown at the moment, where they're keeping journals, and we publish them each week on our university website, and some of them are making videos and audio logs, and it's really, really interesting material. And I think it will, you know, when we look back on it in 6 months' time, when all this is hopefully finished, we'll have a fascinating record of the time that we're living in. So I would encourage prospective journalism students in particular to think about contributing to the public record of the times we're living through at the moment.
Thank you, Simon. Simon, any last sign-off words for Jharkhand Lake City University?
Only to say, you know, I hope that many of you will embark on careers in journalism. You know, there are great professors like yourself, Durga, who are ready to teach you, and I think it's a fantastic profession to go into. I think if nothing else, the current crisis should have shown us all how important journalism is to a healthy and functioning democratic society.
Thank you so much, Simon. It was a fabulous session, and I kind of.
It's a pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Yes, because we have met you offline, and we have realized I think you were fabulous. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah. So everybody out there, thank you so much for joining us for today, for the entire, you know, kind of a 3 sessions we had it since morning: advertising, public relations, as well as journalism. 3 great speakers we had it, and we continue this JLU knowledge series as we go forward. Tomorrow we have the law sessions happening, and maybe on 1st of May we'll come back to you again when we're having some design and film sessions happening, where some noted and marquee speakers will be coming in again. So see you then, and keep looking for the registration links which will come to you from various sources, including the social media pages of JLU as well. Thank you so much, Simon, and I look forward to keep in touch with you and interact with you further.
Absolutely. Thank you, Durga.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.